Good evening and welcome to the National Conservation Training Center. For the three of you I don't know, I'm Mark Madison. I'm the historian out here and organizer of the public lecture series. Appreciate you guys coming out on such a balmy and sunny night. Tonight, the trip is going to be worthwhile. We have a wonderful speaker, Laura Martin. And let me tell you a little about her before I turn it over to her. Laura is a historian and ecologist who studies how people shape the habitats of other species. She's the author of this recent book, Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, and she's written articles in many journals, including Environmental History, Science, and numerous other publications. She's an environmental studies professor at Williams College, former fellow of the Harvard University Center for the Environment, the Stanford Humanities Center, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Science Foundation. The book is a fascinating look at the efforts we put into restoring habitats, restoring species, and finding a way for both humans and our neighbors to flourish. She'll be signing the book after the talk. I just read it this last weekend. It's a great read. I'm sure it's going to be a great presentation. So please give a very warm welcome to Laura Martin.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you to NCTC for the invitation to come out tonight, and thank you to all of you for being here in person, and those of you who might be tuning in later. I'm going to begin by giving you a little background on how I came to write Wild by Design, and then dive into some detail from a chapter that talks about how fears of atomic doomsday shaped ecological restoration and ecologists' and land managers' understandings of the relationship between diversity and ecosystem stability. I began my career as a wetlands ecologist, working in places sometimes but often not as scenic as this restored prairie in central Illinois. More often my field sites looked like this. This is a wetland in central New York that has been overtaken by a non-native grass, Phragmites australis, or common reed, which I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with. I was studying a subspecies of Phragmites that is non-native and considered to be invasive. A subspecies that grows in monoculture and outcompetes many native plant species. And at the time, I was working closely with Fish and Wildlife Service as well as New York State land managers to try and figure out how to reduce populations of this unwanted species. And as I was doing so, became really interested in how ecological science is applied to environmental management and policy. Through a national survey that I did as part of my graduate degree, I determined that there were hundreds of public and private organizations that were using an herbicide, glyphosate, to try and kill non-native Phragmites. In total, they had treated over a course of 5 years an area of about 8,000 hectares. That's about the size of Cape Cod, by mostly spraying herbicide from helicopters, also from backpacks. And it wasn't working. So working hands-on with this plant species and attempting to manage it kind of led me to broader questions about the history of trying to get rid of unwanted species, invasive species, in order to try and protect or cultivate others. And it very gradually and haphazardly motivated my transition out of the field and into the archives to try and understand the history of how people have intentionally created habitat for other species. The question of how to, I'm just going to move this forward a little bit. The question of how to create habitat for other species is one of the most pressing of our century. This is a figure from a paper that came out a year ago now in Nature that found that as of 2020, give or take a few years, human-made or anthropogenic objects now outweigh all of the living beings on Earth. This includes roads, houses, shopping malls, coffee mugs, smartphones, all the other infrastructure of daily life, now weighs a total of approximately 1.1 trillion metric tons, which is equal to all of the combined dry weight of plants, animals, fungi, protists, bacteria, archaea on this planet, which is just a staggering fact. In 1900, just 120 years ago, such artifacts of human activity weighed only about 3% of what they do today. This is just one of an infinite number of ways of visualizing the human impact on the biotic world. Confronted with climate change, ocean acidification, persistent pollution, other extraordinary challenges, many species are struggling. There's currently more than 40,000 species that are threatened with extinction, according to the IUCN. And it's not just that species are going extinct or is threatened with extinction. The number of individuals within any given species is also decreasing. In fact, the Earth has lost about 60% of its vertebrate individuals since just 1960. With climate change and habitat fragmentation and these other changes, caring for wild species increasingly involves human interventions. Through working with ecologists and land managers and thinking across different disciplines, I ended up with a long list of questions about the history of these interventions, the history of ecological restoration, and more broadly, the relationship between environmental destruction and environmental care. In order to understand why organizations were spraying tens of thousands of hectares of wetlands with herbicides in the name of environmental care, I needed to turn to the tools of the discipline of environmental history. My book, Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, which came out this May, analyzes the history of ecological restoration as an idea, a management practice, and a scientific discipline. And I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs from the introduction of the book to give you a sense of the tone of the book and what the project of the book is. Many of us have cared for a pet or a houseplant, species that we choose to live with, that we cherish, that we might even consider family, species that we treat very differently from laboratory animals or species we eat or those we consider pests. We have some sense of what counts as caring for these companion species. We shield them from harm, we provide them with food, shelter, affection, entertainment, medical care, and sometimes monogrammed sweaters. These are accepted ways of expressing care for our creaturely companions. But how does one care for a wild species? We imagine wild species to be autonomous and self-reliant, living outside of the boundaries of human society and activity, unentangled with our landscapes of work and rest. In the eyes of many, human actions, even actions of care, diminish the wildness of species. And yet, in an age of habitat destruction, anthropogenic climate change, and the redistribution of species at a global scale, many wild species will not survive without ongoing and sustained human involvement. How intensively, then, should we intervene to help wild species recover from the harms that humans have inflicted? This is the core question of ecological restoration, a science and a practice that confounds the distinctions we expect to find between the autonomous and the managed, the wild and the designed. Ecological restoration is a mode of environmental management that seeks to respect the world-making and even sometimes the decision-making of other species. Restoration is, in other words, an attempt to co-design nature with non-human collaborators. So many of you in the room are very familiar with just what a diverse range of practices ecological restoration entails. And in the book, I'm specifically interested in efforts to restore species or interactions between species. So I had put aside the question of toxicology and restoration of polluted environments to think about manipulation of species on the landscape. Ecological restoration, as I'm thinking about it, includes controlled burns, so the photograph in the upper right corner. It encompasses, shooting invasive goats on Isla Isabela in the Galapagos. Of course, wolf recovery and restoration is one of the kind of best known and most iconic examples of ecological restoration. And the bottom left photograph is an example of volunteers working with the International Crane Foundation to pretend to be adult whooping cranes, training a baby whooper to fly and hopefully migrate with its flock. And just to put a plug in for the archives here today, I got to see the costume, one of the first costumes that was used by whooping crane restorationists, which the NCTC now holds as part of its archive. So in the 21st century, ecological restoration has become arguably the most influential mode of environmental management in the world, with billions of dollars being invested in restoration by federal agencies, by state agencies, as well as increasingly internationally. The United Nations recently, or just last year, declared this decade to be the decade on ecosystem restoration. And we're seeing, in response, the UN as well as corporations kind of suddenly invest massive amounts into restoration. As the title hints, Wild by Design explores the tensions between wildness and design. What does it mean to try and design an ecosystem that's independent from human influence? What does it mean to intervene in an ecosystem and then, with the goal of stopping that intervention in the future, or seeking to minimize it or even to hide it from visitors, perhaps? The book opens by describing the history of the game restoration movement that preceded the ecological restoration movement in the early 20th century. This was a movement that was focused on large species, usually mammals, some birds, of economic importance. Bison restoration, I argue, is often celebrated as an environmental success story, as a restoration success story. But I show through my archival work that the habitats that were first remade for bison restoration in the United States were established on Indian reservations that the federal government was systematically dismantling under the Dawes Act in order to further erode tribal sovereignty. These bison sites were among some of the first sites in what would become the Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System. The first of these sites was on the Kiowa Comanche Reservation. So when the Kiowa Comanche Reservation in what is now Oklahoma was thrown open to non-Indian settlement in 1901, Congress placed tens of thousands of acres under control of the Department of the Interior, which established the Wichita Forest Reserve. That June, President Roosevelt designated the Forest Reserve as a game reservation, using the word reservation, very intentionally using the same word as Indian reservation, by an unprecedented proclamation. And he deemed this to be a space where hunting, trapping, and capturing game animals and birds would be unlawful unless permitted by the Secretary of Agriculture. Learning of this development, the newly formed American Bison Society, with William Temple Hornaday at its head, offered to provide the Wichita Forest Reserve a nucleus herd from the New York Zoological Park, and on the condition that government then take responsibility for the herd's maintenance. And the American Bison Society described this arrangement as a kind of new type of corporate sacrifice arrangement with the federal government. The federal government agreed, and in November 1905, the U.S. Forest Service invited the New York Zoological Society to send a representative to the newly established game reserve. The Forest Service hired a contractor to construct corrals, sheds, telephone poles, and a newly designed 74-inch high steel wire woven fence that was going to encompass 8,000 acres. Consistent with their focus at the time on promoting only game animals, they rounded up and killed as many predators on the site as they could, including coyotes and wolves. Meanwhile, Hornaday was studying the crates that were used to ship exotic animals to the New York Zoological Park in order to come up with a design that scientists might use to ship bison across the country for the purposes of restoration. On October 11th, 15 bison and 3 humans left the Fordham station in New York City bound for Wichita. They made the 1,858-mile trip in 7 days, and as they did, giant crowds of curious and pushy people greeted them in Cleveland, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and Oklahoma City. The railroad, which had been so central to the destruction of bison, had become a mechanism of bison restoration. Miraculously, all 15 bison survived the journey, and a caravan of wagons hauled the crates across the final 12 miles of prairie to the Wichita Game Reservation. After the successful establishment of this nucleus herd, the American Bison Society resolved to have the Flathead and Crow Indian reservations surveyed with a view to having portions of them set apart as buffalo ranges. The federal government had opened the land, which belonged to the Confederated Tribes of the Flathead, Kootenai, and Upper Pend D'Oreille to non-Indian settlement in 1906. Unfortunately, the American Bison Society wrote in newspapers across the country, quote, "The Indians will have to be paid for any land that might be set aside as a bison range." So this kind of story of appropriating Native American land for the purposes of preservation and conservation has been told in the context of the National Park Service, but I think it's a relatively new story to be thinking about how what would become the Fish and Wildlife Service was also involved in this work, and the fact that many of the earliest National Wildlife Refuge sites were established with the stated intent of taking land and sovereignty away from particular tribes. Restorationist appropriation of the Kootenai and Flathead lands was affirmed in 1908 when Senator Dixon of Montana sponsored a bill that created the 24 square mile buffalo reserve from Flathead Indian reservation lands. This would become the National Bison Range. The Wichita and Montana game reserves were not unique. Many of the first large game reserves across the country were carved out from existing Indian reservation lands. And so one of the main questions I ask in Wild by Design is, what do we do with knowledge of restoration's unjust history? And how can restoration in the future align itself with social justice? After considering the history of the game restoration movement, I think about how restoration became ecological. The question of how ecologists and the scientists in the early discipline of ecology kind of distinguished themselves from the scientists that were doing game restoration, in part in an effort to secure permanent study sites for themselves in the 1920s and 1930s. The work of ecologists and landscape architects like Edith Roberts and Elsa Riemann would inform the design of naturalistic gardens around the world, and their kind of aesthetic of letting a garden direct itself would be highly influential to game restorationists like Aldo Leopold and his colleagues. And there's some examples that I talk about in the book of native plant gardens and naturalistic gardens that I consider to be the first plant restoration sites in the United States that predate the very famous Curtis Prairie restoration site that Leopold oversaw at the University of Wisconsin by almost a decade. And he was in dialogue with some of these ecologists and used their preliminary results from their plant restoration projects to think about what to do at the Curtis Prairie. So after thinking about the influence of restoration of ecology on land management practices, I then turned to the World War II and the atomic age to think about how atomic planning and atomic tools shaped ecological theory and the design of restoration sites. So after World War II, when the United States began detonating atomic weapons at the Marshall Islands, ecologists used the radioisotopes from these nuclear detonations to follow the circulation of elements among species. This was a new way of kind of visualizing connections within ecological communities, and it led to the emergence of the ecosystem concept, which profoundly reshaped restoration practices as well and theory, which I'll dive into in some more depth in a minute. But putting that aside for a second, just to give you an overview of the rest of the book, Part 3 of the book looks at how the kind of uneven propagation of the ecosystem concept in different federal agencies in the 1970s and 1980s gave rise to the practice of killing non-native species, and also gave rise to a new scientific discipline, restoration ecology, with its own professional society, its own conferences, its own consulting firms, and journals. This is the period in which restorationists embraced a pre-colonial baseline for American restoration, and in doing so, kind of naturalized Native American land management. It's also when land managers around the world began to really shift from a hands-off preservation model to a much more interventionist restoration model. Into the 1990s, restoration was increasingly consolidated and privatized. Consolidation was made possible by the rise of off-site mitigation, which is the practice of compensating for ecological harm at one site with ecological restoration or ecological care at a separate site. The Disney Wilderness, I consider in one chapter of the book the history of the Disney Wilderness Preserve, which is one of the world's earliest examples, perhaps the earliest example of a large off-site mitigation project. When looking to expand its parks in 1989, Walt Disney World was required to mitigate wetland destruction by the Clean Water Act. But how to accomplish this mitigation was not regulated at the time. There's now regulations around off-site mitigation. It was a new idea at the time, and in a novel arrangement brokered by the Nature Conservancy, Disney funded a massive restoration project in Central Florida, 15 miles south of their construction site. I argue that offsite mitigation is so important to understand and to understand its history of because it uncoupled sites of harm from sites of care. This was not obvious. It was not an obvious way to go about land management. It was a really new idea, and in doing so, it paved the way administratively as well as conceptually for today's international carbon offsetting market. Offsite mitigation has, in ways I think that environmental scientists and geographers haven't really explored yet, has redistributed ecosystems around the world, at the same time reconfiguring relations between the global north and the global south, fashioning the latter as a source of wild nature that is kind of painted as a resource for compensation for pollution in the global north. And I end the book by thinking about how climate change is increasingly pushing ecologists and land managers towards interventionist management, including assisted migration and assisted evolution. So over the past century, I argue, restorationists shifted from the expectation that nature could essentially recover on its own if left to its own devices, if the kind of damaging action was ceased, whether that was hunting or plowing or logging. Scientists and land managers really shifted from that kind of faith that nature could heal itself if given space to a much more interventionist mindset, recognizing that environmental thriving will always depend upon active management. But strikingly, the idea that intervention in the wild might always be necessary did not come from a recognition of climate change or from unintentional ecological harms. It came from a very intentional ecological harm. It emerged from World War III doomsday planning. The fear of nuclear doomsday was essential to the emergence of the highly influential diversity stability hypothesis. And this really surprised me in researching this book. This is the idea that ecosystems with a greater number of species are better able to withstand disturbance, whether that's climate change or hurricanes, than ecosystems with a fewer number of species. So I'll kind of walk us through my logic here. The 215 above ground and underwater nuclear weapons that were detonated by the United States between 1945 and 1962 utterly transformed the physical and biological environments of the Marshall Islands and the American Southwest. By the mid-1950s, scientists and the public had begun to conceptualize radioactive fallout as a regional threat to human health, and maybe even a global threat to human health. But accompanying this public concern over nuclear fallout was the much blunter fear of nuclear annihilation. In 1950, the United States had 299 nuclear weapons in its stockpile. By 1960, it had 18,638. And by 1965, it had 31,139. As the United States and the Soviet Union massively increased both the power and the range, as well as the number of their nuclear weapons, it became possible to conceive of a global-scale catastrophic war. And so in the early 1960s, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission would fund studies that attempted to predict the consequences of such a war. Along with military planners and sociologists and even science fiction writers, ecologists were tasked by the US government with envisioning a world shaped by the immense destructive power of nuclear weapons. In doing so, ecologists didn't imagine the outcome of World War III to be the total annihilation of life on Earth, because there would have been no point to their engaging in that exercise. Instead, they imagined what biological recovery might look like after nuclear war, and considered how the government could hasten that recovery, how they could invest in ecological restoration. I think it's little remembered today, but the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission was actually the main funder of ecological science from World War II until the mid-1970s, when it was eclipsed by the newly formed National Science Foundation. While atomic ecology flourished, the United States and the Soviet Union were racing to expand their stockpiles. Studies by the RAND Corporation estimated that a first Soviet attack would be aimed at 50 US cities and would result in 90 million casualties. The government responded by promoting the construction of fallout shelters in state buildings and schools and offices. But what would happen to all the other species in the world? One ecologist warned in a 1963 activist newsletter that shelter programs are largely irrelevant to the biological consequences of nuclear war. What would happen to wild plants and animals? Things that would not be protected in fallout shelters. Realizing that the federal government, realizing they had no idea what would happen to what we now call ecosystems, recommended to the Pentagon that they investigate and fund ecological research into post-World War III recovery. In turn, the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, began funding studies in which ecologists would purposefully damage ecological communities, what they called ecosystems, rather than warships or model towns, in order to study if they recovered and whether they recovered, and if they recovered, how they recovered. Ecologists began simulating nuclear attacks, and so began a series of experiments that concretized the idea that ecosystems are material things that humans can damage and even destroy. The first experiment to simulate nuclear attack without an actual weapon occurred on Brookhaven National Laboratory grounds in 1961. Ecologist George Woodwell and his colleagues exposed a former agricultural field as well as an oak pine forest, a photograph of which is here, to continuous gamma radiation from cesium-137 and cobalt-60 for 6 months. Through this fieldwork, Woodwell set out to characterize what he called the relative radiosensitivity of various wild plant species, finding that Senecio, a member of the daisy family, survived high levels of radiation, whereas pine species were really sensitive to radiation and died right away after exposure. This was a new way of viewing and categorizing species, not by their evolutionary relationships, not by taxonomy, and not by the question of what ate what, but by their ability to withstand disturbance. This is an idea, a way of thinking about species that we're all very familiar with today in thinking about which species are more drought tolerant, which species better withstand hurricanes, right? But at the time, the idea of resilience and thinking about studying the resilience of different species was a new field and a new way of thinking about the natural world. In January 1965, Tom Odom and a large team of AEC-funded ecologists installed cesium-137 gamma sources at the Luquillo Experimental Forest in Puerto Rico, a Forest Service site with another site with a kind of complex colonial history. Odom and his collaborators, eventually numbering in the hundreds, irradiated the Luquillo site for 3 months and studied its course of recovery over the next 6 years. By 1970, following the RAND Corporation's recommendation that studies of radiosensitivity be enormously increased, ecologists had placed radiation sources in deciduous forests in New York, in tropical rainforests in Puerto Rico, in a desert in Nevada, and in agricultural fields in Georgia and Tennessee, where ecologists aim to study the effect of radiation on, quote, wild native species. As Woodwell explained in his introduction to his 1965 book, Ecological Effects of Nuclear War, such work was meant to simultaneously clarify, quote, the complex ecological problems involved in nuclear holocaust, as well as to define, quote, the normal patterns of structure, function, and development characteristic of natural ecosystems. This is the route in which destruction became the kind of standard method of studying and understanding ecosystems. This is when ecologists also began clear-cutting, burning, and applying biocides to their field sites. In a particularly dramatic example, in 1967, E.O. Wilson and one of his graduate students, Daniel Simberloff, chose 6 islands in the Florida Bay in which to kill every living animal. They first censused the insects on the island and then tented the islands and fumigated them with methyl bromide. After this, Simberloff went back and recensused the insect communities over time to see whether they returned, and if so, how their compositions differed from what came before. This project was funded by the Department of Defense, and in their write-up of their experimental results, Simberloff and Wilson noted the precedent for their experiment in ecologists' recent irradiation studies. So ecology's involvement with doomsday planning not only made experiments like this possible, it kind of made them thinkable or conceivable in the first place. Crucially to the history of ecological restoration, doomsday simulations and other attacks on ecosystems led scientists to the idea that there's a threshold of damage beyond which ecosystems can no longer repair themselves. This was another kind of new idea at the time. Since the 19th century, ecologists and land managers had imagined that ecological communities could repair themselves once a damaging action ended, whether that was plowing, hunting, logging, etc. This view prevailed through the 1950s, and it was bolstered by studies of farmland that was abandoned at first in New England and then during the Dust Bowl in the Midwest, where ecologists were observing the rapid and natural process of reforestation. But doomsday planning suggested that ecosystems could lose the ability to self-repair. Writing under contract for the Department of Defense, one scientist reported that ecosystems could become so damaged that restoration could never be more than partial and incomplete. I think, really interestingly, doomsday planning also entrenched the diversity stability hypothesis, which is today the basis of most environmental management. Indeed, biodiversity remains a kind of key proxy, a key measurement for ecosystem health, and even for wildness. The diversity stability hypothesis is the idea that species diversity confers resiliency, that ecosystems containing more species will vary less in response to disturbances, whether that's climate change or nuclear explosions. In 1969, George Woodwell wrote that species diversity makes the community as a whole resilient in the face of disaster, whether that disaster is ionizing radiation or a gardener's hoe. Ecologist World War III simulations then solidified the idea of this threshold of ecosystem damage and the diversity stability hypothesis, two theories that are now very familiar to us, both assembled on a bedrock of destruction. Ecologists laid waste to forests and dispersed biocides, all to challenge the view that nature could heal itself. Each of these ideas would profoundly reshape the practice and the science of ecological restoration. And what would continue to haunt the discipline of ecology even after the end of the Cold War was not the kind of blunt possibility of global nuclear annihilation, but the much subtler specter of irreversible ecological change. Ecologists were converging on the view that humans, whether through nuclear weapons or through other large-scale disturbances like deforestation and pollution, might make it so ecosystems can no longer repair themselves. In the world that ecologists envisioned, human management of ecosystems would by necessity be ongoing and without end. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And today I'm with Laura Martin, who's a professor at Williams College in the Environmental Studies program, and has just come out with a wonderful book, Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, that actually has a lot to say about the work we do in the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we're very excited. She's come in for a public lecture and to talk a little about her book this afternoon with us. So thank you, Laura. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And the first question, sadly, is an obvious one, but what made you come to write this particular book?
I had a circuitous path to writing this book. I began my career as a wetlands ecologist. I was working as a graduate student at Cornell University in the Natural Resources program and was working with invasive species management. I was working with Fish and Wildlife Service, actually, as well as New York Department of Conservation, trying to get rid of non-native genotypes of Phragmites. And as I was doing that, became really interested in management practices around invasive species, started dabbling and reading about the history of land management in the United States to try and understand what I, as a scientist, was doing in interfacing with managers, and discovered an entire community of people, historians, who were thinking about the deep history of how scientists, as well as the federal government, state governments, have thought about land management and ecological management over time. And I got really interested in how management became ecological. That was kind of the guiding question in finding this. I really found, this Wild by Design is about the broad history of ecological restoration, but I got into it with very specific questions about the history of invasive species management and wanting to understand exactly when it was in American history and management history that scientists and managers and the public began caring about invasive species.
When did they become interested in?
Later than I thought they did.
Yeah.
So I expected in writing this book, I was in graduate school in the early 2000s at a time where there was a lot of debate within ecology and conservation biology around the idea of novel ecosystems. And this was a really, at the time, contentious idea that human action has created these assemblages of species that are unprecedented and that maybe we should let them be and not be trying to intervene and to kind of accept that with given climate change, new assemblages of species are what we're going to find in habitats moving forward. And this really freaked out a lot of restorationists, conservation biologists who had worked for decades trying to bring ecosystems back to a historical baseline, trying to get rid of species that were found in the U.S. context weren't found prior to 1492. And so I expected, because this was such a huge, the use of temporal baselines in ecosystem restoration was such a huge topic when I was in school, I assumed that that topic had dominated restoration for its entire history. And when I went to the archives, and writing this book was a complicated endeavor because there's no one archive of restoration. It's something that the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, as well as individual ecologists, individual universities have been involved in, and then lots of nonprofits and volunteer groups like the American Bison Society, Audubon Society, right, have been involved in for decades, but in different capacities with overlapping missions. And so there was no one archive. I was looking at, but piecing this all together, I expected to find debate about historical baselines and returning plant and animal communities to past communities early on in restoration, and was intrigued that it really didn't take off as a controversy and topic until the 1980s. Maybe a few conversations in the 1970s, but that prior to the 1970s and 1980s, restorationists were trying to do other things that were separate from historical fidelity. They were much more focused on returning robust populations of individual species or groups of species, but were not as concerned with what we would call today, historical fidelity or bringing back an entire ecosystem to a former state.
Yeah, the Endangered Species Act is kind of species specific, isn't it, from the listing and so on. In fact, you open up with whooping cranes. Why was that a good, iconic example of restoration?
Yeah, so I start the book with the example of whooping crane restoration and the way in which it, prior to coming under the purview of the Fish and Wildlife Service, was very much volunteer driven and very scientists and concerned public did not know what to do about whooping crane numbers. Their numbers were down. I think it was around 40 individuals in the wild. This really polarized people who cared about whooping cranes as to whether it made sense to do a really last-minute interventionist thing like breed them in captivity, or whether scientists and managers should just leave them alone and protect habitat. So this kind of more passive habitat protection and restoration was pitted against active captive breeding. And I start the book because the example of early attempts to captively breed whooping cranes is such an incredible example of the efforts, the really extreme and dedicated efforts that people have gone through to try and bring wild species back from the brink of extinction. And I'm interested in Wild by Design in that tension between the desire to keep species self-reliant or autonomous from human influence, and the necessity in a world that is so changed by humans, and in a world where climate change has changed everything, the necessity to intervene, something that the Fish and Wildlife Service is very familiar with, but that I think people outside of that management context don't always realize just how much work and labor goes into maintaining space and resources for wild species. And so whooping cranes, I think, are just this, whooping crane restoration is an early example, which is part of why I opened the book with it, but it also is just an incredible example of individual scientists creating relationships with individual whooping cranes that are really intimate and loving even. So I begin by talking about George Archibald's work pretending to be a male whooping crane for multiple mating seasons and living with a female whooping crane to try and shift her into reproductive.
It's an evocative opening.
Yeah, shift her into reproductive capacity. And finally, when this endangered whooping crane does produce a viable egg, Archibald said that he felt like the father of that egg. And so, the question I posed at the beginning is, many of us have species that we choose to live with like pets, like houseplants. And we have some sense of how to care for those species, what it means to care for them, whether that's providing medical treatment or shelter or entertainment, taking a dog to a dog park, right? But we don't have a good intuition, and I think it strikes a lot of people even as paradoxical to care for wild species, which we imagine to be outside of care, outside of human care.
Keep wildlife wild,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Well, the first detailed example you looked at, the American Bison Society, seemed less interested in keeping the bison wild, sending them from zoos and so on. Was it less of an issue?
Yeah, so
back then?
the first chapter of the book looks at the history of the American Bison Society, and I use that to illustrate a shift from what came before ecological restoration, game restoration, or big game management.
Yep.
And then think about in the subsequent chapters how an ecological, the lens of scientific ecology gets applied to game management and kind of shifts it to what we now think of as ecological management. But the American Bison Society, I argue, was specifically interested in restoring bison populations, not necessarily ones we would think of as wild. They wanted them as a resource for elite white hunters in order to, and for white tourists that were going to the West in order to consume, basically. And many in the American Bison Society were also eugenicists and believed in breeding wild bison to be larger, stronger, to be used as, they argued they should be used as draft animals in the West. And so there wasn't a concern that, I think the restoration of bison in the United States is often told today as a restoration success story. And I think it's important that we understand that the goals of bison restorationists in the early 20th century were very different from the goals of bison restorationists today, or ecological restorationists today.
Well, one of the nice things about the book, and something we've grappled with recently, is you're looking at a very sophisticated way at the motives. So a lot of these conservationists, as you know, were eugenicists. Did their ideas about human eugenics also play into their conservation efforts?
They did, for sure, and I think something that has surprised readers of the book, and that surprises my students, is to realize that human eugenicists and wildlife eugenicists were the same people. It was the same idea, the same people. The idea was that government or human communities should intervene in the evolutionary trajectory of either people or other species like bison, and this was underpinned by a white supremacist ideology. And so the consequence of that for bison restoration and for the founding of the National Wildlife Refuge system is that the first bison restoration sites, including the National Bison Range, were set aside, were carved out of Indian reservation lands. The argument being that that land was better, it was a fully transparently white supremacist argument that that land was better used as bison habitat for the benefit of white settlers than it was used by tribes. And so this mindset, this eugenicist and white supremacist mindset, shaped both how early scientists and restorationists tried to manipulate wildlife, but it also shaped their politics in how they where they argued restoration should occur. And I think, increasingly the public is aware of the history of how the U.S. National Park System was established largely through dispossessing Native Americans from their homelands and and the federal government using the military to kick people out of their homes in order to create national parks. I think it's a much less told story that some, not all, but some of the earliest wildlife refuges in the country similarly were established by forcibly removing people, removing Native Americans from their homes, and stealing land from reservation systems.
Is there still a social justice aspect to restoration ecology, or is that something that ended in the first half of the 20th century?
It's something I argue that, so I end the book by arguing, but with a call for restoration ecologists and policymakers to think about how the goals of ecological restoration can be brought into alignment with the goals of social justice and environmental justice. Because I think today there are new examples of people either already being displaced or the threat of displacing people in the name of biodiversity restoration. So if we look at forestry-based carbon offsetting projects, which are largely happening in the global south, some of these mega projects are happening, are actively displacing people from their communities. And so there's a real, but I also think that restoration, I interpret restoration to be an activity that is fundamentally about trying to undo the effects, to undo harm, to undo aspects of violence against other species. And so I want to broaden that out and think about how can we more expansively think about restoration as addressing harms caused both to non-human species as well as to human communities.
That's an interesting way to put it. So both can flourish, as you end your book with. So does the Endangered Species Act mark a pivot point in restoration efforts?
Yeah, I in the second half of the book argue that the amendments of the 1973 amendments to the Endangered Species Act are a real moment of transformation in both restoration practices. Mm-hmm. In the 70s, the science of restoration ecology didn't exist under that name yet. Right. It was still kind of cobbled together from many different fields. It wasn't until the 80s that scientists started identifying as restoration ecologists in particular. And I argue that part of why they start identifying as restoration ecologists was because of the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Mm-hmm. That the Endangered Species Act of 1973 creates, under Section 7, this new kind of bureaucratic necessity for recovery plans that opens up a need for expertise in defining recovery and what recovery means and what not just what critical habitat is, but how to foster that habitat. And so, and it really reorients. It creates a new unit in the Fish and Wildlife Service that is somewhat at odds with other work that the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing at the time. So much of the Fish and Wildlife Service's efforts prior to the 1970s were asking how to kill certain native species like predators and rodents. Sure. And so, and then you have within the same agency scientists asking how to undo those actions. And so
restore wolves.
Yeah, wolves are the kind of the best example that I can think of with this. And so it's really an interesting case where the way in which this law gets implemented and the regulations that surround the Endangered Species Act and the kind of internal agency decisions around the Endangered Species Act, I argue in the book, are really one of the main reasons that restoration ecology emerges as a scientific discipline in the 1980s.
It's a very thoughtful look at our agency, because a lot of the things you said, maybe preservation of habitat and so on, is really the refuge system. We have a law enforcement division, and restoration kind of adds another element to what we're trying to do. And then predator rodent control, huge issue that we offload later on in the 1980s. So I would love how you looked at the evolution of the agency. And the technical expertise, absolutely, one of our most popular courses here just teaches Section 7 from the Endangered Species Act. There's a almost insatiable demand for that course. So you've looked at restoration ecology as a historian over a long temporal period of time, over 100 years. Are there some restoration projects that seem to have met this golden mean of allowing animals and humans to flourish in a sustainable way?
I get asked this question a lot, and I need to find more. No, it's, I think, there are increasingly examples. I love small-scale examples of restoration efforts that happen in, so I teach in Western Massachusetts, and the town that is neighboring our campus has an incredible PCV problem in their rivers that affects both human health and the fish populations this is the Hoosick River in Western Massachusetts. And there's really creative things being done right now to think about how to simultaneously address economic injustice in the area, create recreation and employment opportunities for residents through river habitat restoration. Mm-hmm. And so that's a super local example. I think at the national scale, the story of the national bison refuge is a really instructive one. It was the second big game refuge established in the United States. It was established through the lobbying efforts of the American Bison Society, so very much, and it carved land out of the Flathead Indian Reservation, and just in January 2021, the Department of the Interior transferred ownership and management back to the Salish and Kootenai tribes. And so I think this is I think we'll see increasingly examples where restoration sites and restoration projects and agencies tasked with restoration are thinking about how to address historical injustices against people and better involve communities and landowners in restoration projects.
It's a positive note. All right, two quick questions. One technical. You mentioned restoration ecology was looking to sometimes restore ecosystems to what they looked like before 1492. It seems an odd choice. You could go back to any year, or perhaps an easier year, say 100 years. I mean, was it largely accepted by conservation biologists that everything went to hell after 1492, or or was that just an accepted tradition that went about?
This is the origin of the 1492 baseline in restoration is something that puzzled me as I was writing the book. Like I said, I expected a much longer tradition of thinking about temporal baselines for restoration, and realized that this kind of obsession with returning ecosystems to a pre-colonial baseline didn't really ramp up until the 1980s. And it comes out of a few different places. I argue, in part it comes out of the Leopold report for the National Park Service, which recommended that the National Park Service manage national parks to appear as they would have to white colonists. I think a recommendation and conclusion that we would find very problematic today, but that happens in the 1960s. So there's this kind of aesthetic reason that the National Park Service starts thinking about temporal baselines. There's also, I think, interesting administrative reasons why people start thinking about invasive species as species that came after European colonization. And I think, in part, it's that I argue that the Endangered Species Act placed the ability to manipulate endangered native species entirely with the federal government. And prior to that, it had been volunteers and NGOs that had been working with species like whooping cranes. And so that leaves organizations and land trusts, which were really taking off in the 1970s, like the biggest ones being the Nature Conservancy, but also lots of little land trusts. They were no longer able to directly manipulate endangered native species themselves, but there were no restrictions on what would be done with non-native species. And so I think that also created an incentive to turn toward non-native species manipulations and management, because there was not a permitting process involved, basically. So I think, and there's also, I think, a crisis over the idea of globalization in the 1980s. But I think that coming from a background in ecology, I think a lot of my ecologist colleagues assumed, invasive species became an ecological problem in later decades, in the 1980s, 1990s, because of increased global trade. Yeah. And the data doesn't really support, non-native invasive species were being introduced to the United States since its founding, and many examples of our most, problematic invasive species come from the early 20th century, and land managers and scientists were well aware of those species in the early 20th century. So it's not that all of a sudden there was a crisis with invasive species in the 1980s. It's rather that people just became interested in pre-colonial landscapes at that time.
That's fascinating stuff. The whole book is fascinating, but let me ask you an unfair question to ask somebody who's written a historical book. But as you've looked at all these examples of restoration and wildlife restoration in particular, are there any best practices that come out that people could look at going forward, having looked at about 120 years or so of attempts to bring back bison, whooping cranes, wolves, all sorts of species? Any guidelines or suggestions?
Yeah, I think the two, my two takeaways from having been deep in this history are, first, that I'm wary of the mega project. I think that having a diversity of different approaches to restoration in the landscape is the way forward. And I'm wary of the mega project primarily because of its politics. I mean, the biggest argument in Wild by Design is that restoration is not only a technical activity or pursuit, that it's a political one, that it has to be a political one, because it's decisions about which species get to live on the landscape and which species do not, and certain people get to are empowered to make those decisions, and others are not. And so I think in thinking about ways in which local residents can be involved in restoration, ways in which small sites that might be overlooked for restoration, urban sites for restoration, how to, I'm really interested in how to foster ecological restoration in those sorts of places. And I think, and that's going to become increasingly important to think about as the UN just recently declared this to be the decade on ecosystem restoration.
Oh, timely plug for the
So
book.
the UN, the UN and private corporations are suddenly putting real resources into restoration. So I think we're going to see a explosion of restoration work around the world. And so I think we need to be thinking carefully about what scale that restoration occurs at. And the other piece is that I think there's a real danger in pursuing increased biodiversity restoration without thinking about the impact on human communities. There's also a real opportunity for aligning biodiversity restoration with environmental justice and with thinking about projects that can pursue both ecosystem health and human health. And that we can use the concept that environmental justice activists and scholars have developed of procedural justice to think about environmental restoration as well. So thinking about who is empowered to make decisions about the environment and through what processes decisions are made about restoration.
Well, thank you for the very thoughtful and sage advice to end this brief interview. The book is Wild by Design. It's a wonderful look at not only our agency, going all the way back to the Biological Survey, but really a century plus of trying to restore the environment. So thank you, Laura.
Thank you.